Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this CIJR event. My name, for those of you who don't know, is Jacob Kinzler, and I'm the National Chairman of the Board, and very happy to welcome you. We'll be discussing today a book that was published by CIJR, and the title is Zionism and Indigenous Struggle, Aboriginal Americans and the Jewish State. This book was co-authored by two of our esteemed members of the board, who are the panelists tonight, and they are Nathan Elberg and Machla Abramovitz. I want to just mention the fact that the contributors to this book are people who are Native Americans, Jews, academics, a rabbi, a Native American academic, and people also with a mixed background whose parents are Native and Jewish. So it's a pretty interesting book to read. And we also, I think we're very lucky to have in our audience some other members of our board, and also one, especially I want to mention Barbara Kay, who wrote actually a review, a very interesting review about this book. For those of you interested, we actually can send you the link to this article, okay? I will first start by introducing Professor Krantz, who's our director and founder of the Institute. And Fred, please go ahead.
The Canadian Institute for Jewish Research is Canada's unique independent pro-Israel academic think tank. We are now in our 32nd year of functioning. Our internationally recognized and nonprofit institute exists to bring objective, up-to-date news and analysis of Israel and the Jewish people directly and quickly to the public. That is, the public which is Jewish and non-Jewish. And also we exist to work very closely. It's one of the things we're quite good at and have compiled a remarkable record on, to work very closely with our students, who are increasingly, as you know, exposed to rabid anti-Zionist and anti-Semitic propaganda, BDS campaigns on campus. CIJR groups highly respected academics and trained laymen from across Canada, including Israel as well, and the United States. Our online and print publications and seminars and colloquia are directed at the public, at government, and the media. Our Baruch Cohen Israel Internship Program plays a key role in ensuring Jewish continuity by training students to defend Israel and the Jewish people through informed speaking and writing, both on and off campus. And many of the products of that internship program have gone on to major positions in the Jewish world, in business, law, and academia. I hope you enjoyed tonight's program, which has been put together by my CIJR colleagues and friends, Machla Abramovitz and Nathan Elberg, who are also the editors and authors of the book on Zionism and Indigenous Struggle, which is the focus of tonight's discussion. The Zoom seminar will be chaired by our outstanding board chairman, Jack Kinzler, whom you've already met. In closing, I would simply say that I hope you will find the evening's program and the work of the Institute generally worthy and well worth supporting. We're in a difficult time, the pandemic year, ravages of coronavirus. Nonprofits have a difficult time. Endowments, nonprofit endowments are down in terms of contributions. So I hope if you find our work useful and interesting and worthwhile, you will make a CIJRisrael.org, and you will support the work of our academic fellows and laymen and our wonderful students. Their work is for Israel and for the Jewish people. So I thank you again, and I invite you to enjoy tonight's program. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fred. So without further ado, I'll introduce the panelists. And I'll start with Nathan. Nathan Elberg is a retired realtor, anthropologist, and recovered ex-radical. He lived and hunted with Indians and Inuit. He's been tear gassed, rebuilt his car's transmission, had a bayonet in his face, and hitchhiked across the continent. Nathan has studied folklore, warfare, Kabbalah, primitive art, and communications, among other things. His essays and stories have been published in a variety of venues. Elberg studied with the late Dr. Michael Harner, a practicing shaman and recognized expert on cannibalism. Nathan's father, Yehuda Elberg, was a world-renowned Yiddish author and lecturer, a scholar in residence at Oxford University. His mother was a poet and translator, and Nathan is a descendant of the Maharal, no less, Rashi and Hillel. Through them, he's related to King David, no more, no less. Nathan has recently put aside his royal prerogative to rule the galaxy so he could devote more time to writing. Very, very funny. He's a member of the Canadian Fantasy and Science Fiction, no wonder, Association, and he's chairman of the International Board of Directors of the Canadian Institute for Jewish Research. Elberg's been married for many decades, married only once, and has been blessed with children and grandchildren. And now about Machla. Machla Abramovitz is a fellow with the Canadian Institute for Jewish Research and is currently its publication editor. Those daily briefings you get every day, Machla is the one that puts them together. And of course, Professor Kranz is always there in the background to make sure that it happens the right way. She has an MA in English Literature from Concordia University and an MLS from McGill University. Machla is a freelance journalist and author, fiction and nonfiction, who writes for multiple international magazines. Her articles have been translated into German and French. In her spare time, she is writing a book on Jewish education. Her interests span a variety of topics, including Torah, politics, psychology, physics, metaphysics, and medicine, and has written extensively on all these subjects. This is Machla. I would like just to add that Machla will first introduce the book for a few minutes, and thereafter she's going to start the interview with Nathan. So, Machla, now it's your turn, and you can go ahead. Thank you very much for now.
Thank you, Jack. I want to begin by thanking all of you for joining us in our first Zoom webinar. And on behalf of Nathan Elberg and the CIJR, I would especially like to extend our warmest thanks to Canadian columnist and author Barbara Kay for her comprehensive and complimentary review of Zionism and Indigenous struggle. Her review was published on November 25th in the online magazine Post Millennial. If you haven't had a chance to read it, it is available on the CIJR website, Isranet.org, and Barbara Kay's personal website. Let me give you a little introduction to the book and how it came about. In 2014, Nathan Elberg brought Native Americans and connection to Jews and Zionism to the CIJR's attention. At the time, the BDS movement, a Palestinian initiative that promotes boycotts, divestments, and sanctions against the state of Israel, had been ongoing for about 9 years. The subject, incredibly timely, was that the word redwashing had recently joined the lexicon of terms in the battle for human rights. To condemn corporations that supported Aboriginal culture and education. Why? True intentions, activists said, were to, quote, obfuscate harmful practice and history of colonialism. Before long, BDSers jumped on the Aboriginal bandwagon and incorporated this term for their purposes. In early 2013, the American University Beirut Center for American Studies and Research held an international conference titled Transnational American Studies. One of their panel discussions was called Redwashing, Israeli Claims to Indigeneity, the Political Role of Native Americans. Native American and Palestinian academics specializing in colonialism, comparative Native sovereignty issues, critical race studies, English literature, and history organized the panel. It claimed that Israel's promotion of ties with the indigenous peoples of America was, quote, a deliberate strategy to conceal the continuing violations of the Palestinian people. Why did they take on the subject, and why then? The year before, several events took place between Native Americans and Israel that alarmed BDS activists. In December, Navajo Nation President Ben Shelley met with diplomats and members of the Arizona-Israel Business Council in Israel to discuss a follow-up visit by Israeli farmers to speak to Navajo farmers at a two-day agriculture conference. Earlier that year, a First Nations group led by Cree First Nation Grand Chief David Harper officially visited the Knesset to show their support. Moreover, 30 young Aboriginal leaders from Canada traveled to Israel to study culture and society in the Zionist state as part of the Youth Leadership Development Mission to Israel, under the auspices of Canada's Centre for Israel and Jewish Affairs and the Jewish Federation of Winnipeg. More alarming still, from their perspective, the popular Native American poet and performer Joy Harjo Muskogean dared to reject, quote, mass appeals that she abide by the academic and cultural boycott of Israel and took up instead a residency at Tel Aviv University, one of the panel's organizers said. Surprisingly to them, these events came on the heels of several BDS successes. World-renowned theoretical physicist Stephen Hawking's decision to boycott a conference in Israel and several prestigious academic associations' endorsement of BDS. Among them, the Modern Languages Association planned on hosting a panel on BDS at its annual convention. So in 2014, many good things were happening to strengthen Israeli and Native American ties, while at the same time, the BDS movement was pushing forward with efforts to sever them permanently. Their objective, it soon became clear, was to hijack the Native American struggle for rights and recognition into the framework of Palestinian suffering. Nathan Elberg had been following this development for some time from an up-close and personal perspective. In the 1970s and 1980s, he lived among the Cree Indians in Quebec's James Bay region and the Inuit in Quebec's Hudson Bay region and Labrador. He befriended many Native Americans, friendships he maintains to this day. The CIJR was interested in the subject for several reasons. We felt that an in-depth look at Native American-Israel relations was long overdue. What constitutes Indigenous rights? Who is considered Aboriginal to the land? These were some of the questions being debated on campuses, especially as regards Israel. We also felt it would provide a platform for Native American pro-Israel voices to publicly express their positions and assert their identities in their own words. Most refuse to see themselves as perpetual victims and resent having that label imposed on them by well-meaning Westerners. Moreover, the very issue of authenticity itself was well worth examining. What started as an online journal grew into an anthology of articles examining the relationship between Native American and Jewish issues. There was no shortage of knowledgeable contributors, many of whom were CIJR academic fellows. Alan Hertz, an Israeli ambassador to Canada, Alan Baker, tackled Israel's historical and legal right to the land of Israel. In his article, Hertz, a former senior advisor to the Privy Council office in Canada's federal government, including Aboriginal matters, differentiates between Aboriginal and Indigenous rights and makes the historical and legal case for Jews as the Aboriginal inheritors of the Holy Land. Professor Sally Zurcher, Professor Emerita of Toronto's York University, exposes what she calls the big lie concerning Israel's so-called occupation of the West Bank, let alone Israel proper. Moving farther afield, Concordia University's Dr. Ira Robinson explicates the 2005 David Hanenecke affair that gripped Canadian jury at the time. David Hanenecke was a significant First Nations leader whose legacy was compromised by his public expressions of anti-Semitism. In his article, Dr. Robinson explains how inadequacies in the Canadian legal system prevented Jews from confronting Aboriginal anti-Semitism, and what they and Native Americans did to build ties between their respective communities. In another vein, scholars Howard Schwartz and Chacham Jose Farr Zatzal analyzed deeper connections between Aboriginals and Jews, focusing on Christian anti-Semitism and racism. Then there were the voices of Native Americans themselves. Dr. David Yeagley, a Renaissance man and intellectual, decries the exploitation of Native Americans at the hands of liberals and the ignorance within Native American communities regarding Jews and Israel. In one of the last articles he wrote before his premature death in 2014, Dr. Yeagley, a somewhat controversial figure in his own right, vigorously denounces attempts to equate Native Americans' plight to those of the so-called Palestinians, an endeavor he calls bizarre. Palestine is not a country, he writes. Palestinian does not denote a language, a religion, a culture, or an ethnicity. It is a myth. It is a political vision and the most ill-founded, perverted, money laundering in modern times. That Indians should also be used to support other political groups in the world who claim abuse, as if Indians are the universal mascot of the oppressed, is something I simply cannot tolerate. Taking a less aggressive tone, Métis Ryan Belrose elucidates what he sees as the intrinsic connection between his people and the Jews. Métis are known as the bridge people, the go-betweens for white people and Indians, he writes. What it means is that we don't fit in anywhere entirely, unless it's with our people, or oddly enough, another group of people who have been marginalized and oppressed like the Jews. Many Métis easily buy into the notion that Jews, as white people, are oppressors, he explains. However, being white is not about skin tone, it's about privilege, he tells the Métis indoctrinated against Jews in Israel. Because Jews were not considered white, they were always lesser and not safe, because no matter how high they got, they could lose it in a second, he says, a state of being many Métis can quickly identify with. To help build bridges between indigenous communities, including Jews in Israel, Belrose co-founded the nonprofit Indigenous Bridges. He gives talks on indigenous people and the Middle East and works on bringing Israeli water technology to First Nations in Canada. Yet another Native American, Ukhatuk Mark, an Inuit and Anglican, describes his visit to Israel and Canada with the Canada Awakenings Ministry tour. Not only did he find it spiritually uplifting, but the Jewish state taught him much about preserving one's culture. Eliezer ben Yehuda's accomplishments in reinvigorating the Hebrew language, he says, profoundly resonated with him. Besides losing our culture, we also lost our language. After hearing about what Ben Yehuda did, I felt encouraged. Perhaps we too can reinvigorate our language, albeit with much effort on our parts. In this regard, Mark's hopes were realized. Since our conversation, Inuktitut is currently experiencing a revival. It's taught in schools and is considered the official language of Nunavut, the northern country designated by the Canadian government as an independent, indigenously governed territory. Those of mixed heritage, though, provide some of the most penetrating and insightful observations regarding identity. Scott Benlevy and Mara Cohn write movingly about what it's like to integrate Jewish and Aboriginal identities. I walk two worlds, writes Scott Benlevy, half Jewish, half Shawnee Indian, who made Aliyah some years back. Mara Cohn describes what it's like to be an Aglawa Sioux Jewish woman. Learning to honor both ways within the constraints of the other was hard, and not always knowing my place and growing up without the boundaries most have in knowing who they are. My Jewish faith upheld me through those times, she writes. Taking a more literary approach, Dr. Jay Corwin, professor of Spanish and Latin American literature, whose mother was Tlingit and father was Jewish, examines how Native American and Jewish narrative experiences converge and what they have in common, which include, quote, mass deportations, genocide, harassment, and victimization. As a man of mixed heritage and an academic, his unique perspective enables him to contemplate and expose the myths underlying Western society that he believes disempower Native Americans and Jews. As you can see, the subject is vast and well worth pursuing, especially today, considering what many analysts see as the Marxist takeover of our universities, media, and liberal institutions, which at its core is anti-American and anti-Israel. Nathan Elberg, this subject is very personal to you, having befriended many Native Americans over the years. Let's dive more deeply into some of the issues raised in our anthology, keeping in mind that nobody can ultimately speak for Native Americans as they can speak for themselves. Alan Hertz makes the case that from all the indigenous people living in the land of Israel, quote, Jews have the strongest claim to be the Aboriginal peoples of the Holy Land. What is the difference between being indigenous and being Aboriginal to a land? And how does he make his case regarding the Jews?
There are some words that get tossed around a lot in confusion. Aboriginal and indigenous are among those words. They get used interchangeably, but they have very different meanings. Aboriginal means first in the land. Indigenous means born in the land. So, for example, Americans who view themselves as Americans first can say they are indigenous to America, but they can't say they're Aboriginal or Native Americans. Native Americans can be both Aboriginal Indians and Indigenous Americans. The Jewish people is Aboriginal to its ancestral homeland in the same way that the First Nations or Indian tribes are Aboriginal to their ancestral lands in the Americas. Many Western Jews, especially the left-leaning ones, don't see Jews as indigenous, let alone Aboriginal to the land of Israel. But if we would look at the United Nations definition of indigenous, we obviously fit in that category. Jews became a people, became a nation in the Holy Land, always referencing their land in their prayers and laws. They're described as a separate people by Assyrian, Egyptian, and Babylonian era biblical archaeological texts. Furthermore, Christianity and Islam, although they may argue now, historically recognize the priority of Judaism in the land. Islam did not claim Aboriginal status when it was first in the land. That's a modern strategy. It's clear that there are no other claimants who can establish an earlier presence in the land. Aboriginal rights imply the right to self-determination, to control your lives in your own homeland, And that's what Israel is doing.
Okay, let's get on to another subject slightly. We're living in an age of identity politics, where the issue of authenticity often takes center stage. The Inuit, especially the younger ones, have been grappling with this issue for decades. What does it mean to them to be authentically Inuit?
Okay, we cannot assume that all Native people are homogenous. Each one of them takes a different approach, a different view. So we'll take the Inuit as an example. When I was in the community, many people described themselves as 5-year-olds, even though their chronological age was decades higher. They ascribed this to being given a non-Inuit education starting at the age of 5. One Inuk had a fairly straightforward definition of being a real Inuk. That is, someone who can live off the land in winter, away from the settlement. This definition, while having the advantage of simplicity, denies the authenticity of many people who usually are considered Inuit, and certifies many Chadlunak, non-Inuit, as Inuit because they can hunt and live off the land. A young man once told me a traditional story. There was a poor woman who was a beggar. Once people went by kayak to the cliffs to gather myrrh eggs, and they left her on the bottom without food or water. She started to get concerned, and she climbed the cliffs, clinging to them like Spider-Man, you know, the comic. She got to the top before the others, although she had started after. After this young person concluded his story, he said to me, "You see, we are real Inuit. We tell these stories. I learned this from my father, who learned it from their forefathers." I asked, does the cultural reference to Spider-Man invalidate the authenticity of this Eskimo tale? I think not. Must one abandon a world, a way of life, and then pick up or mimic another? Will real Inuit vanish into display cases, books, and YouTube videos? It's time that the people in southern Canada stopped evaluating the authenticity of contemporary Inuit according to the standards for previous generations of Inuit. The situation is summarized by a profound statement made by a young Inuk. We are now in the space age, but my ancestors were in the Stone Age. Now that we are in the space age, we have lost a lot of things that are of the Stone Age Inuit. And in that way, we are not true blood Inuit. It's very sad, but it was inevitable that we would end up in the space age. We are aware of people going to the moon, and we're using speedboats and things like that. But still, we are saying we are Inuit. And some people are saying that we are too much of spacemen, not enough Stone Age men. In that way, I'm mixed up.
How does religion factor into the equation, given that so many Native Americans converted to Christianity? What are their perceptions of it?
Separation of religion as an entity of its own can be misleading. The anthropologist Dorothy Lee writes that all economic activities such as hunting, gathering fuel, cultivating the land, storing food, assume a relatedness to the encompassing universe. With many cultures, this is a religious relationship. In such societies, men recognize a certain spiritual worth and dignity in the universe. Worship of a supreme being is not necessarily involved. When an Inuk, an Eskimo, makes sure to keep the meat and fur of land animals separate from the meat and fur of sea animals, is it a religious act, pagan behavior, or simple economic activities? This issue is relevant to Jews as well. Chacham Jose Fauer builds on the notion that Judaism is not a religion. It's a nation with a constitution, national memory, national symbols, and national institutions. Attempts to challenge the Torah of Israel, he says, are thus not just theological or intellectual disagreements, but political attacks. The splitting off of religion from other aspects of life made the Jewish connection more difficult for enlightened secular people to understand. Now, I had some religious discussions when I was up north. I asked an Inuk about the characters in traditional Eskimo stories. Could they be angels, but with different names? No, he answered. Their names are not mentioned in the Bible. I asked the Pentecostal if a person had to accept Jesus to go to heaven. He replied in the affirmative, and that the alternative was to go to hell. I asked him about his pre-contact ancestors, who never had a chance to hear about Jesus. Are they all in hell? I asked. He replied that he never thought about that. The Inuit don't see a contradiction between being Christian and being a traditional Inuk. Stories adapt, beliefs adapt. They're aware of the distinctions, and it doesn't have to be a problem. Some of the most traditional Inuit I've met are Pentecostal, leading a stable life.
Interesting. But how did they reconcile modernity with their ancient way of life?
An insightful person told me that Inuit culture had certain values that it was inevitably going to lose. We are in the process, he said, of losing it completely. We seem to be heading in a direction where everything is computerized, where everything will be in the space age. And if we want to survive, we had better be a part of that system.
And are they? How are they managing with that? Are they keeping it?
As far as I can see, they're adapting quite well.
I know that many of them have become professionals. They're doing. I know in Nunavut, there are quite a number of professionals who are working there, especially in the medical profession. Which brings me to my next question. A Jewish doctor who worked in Nunavut told me that some Inuit admitted to him that in their minds, people are divided into two groups, Aboriginals and non-Aboriginals. Along these same lines, Jews define themselves relative to anti-Semitism. Do Native Americans similarly define themselves relative to the white man who brought with him sorrow and destruction? Does this sense of grievance make them vulnerable to exploitation?
There's an Eskimo origin story for the non-Eskimo, which is that an Inuit woman had relations with a dog, and she gave birth, and her progeny, in one version of the story, were the white folks, and in another version of the story, the progeny were the Indians. So that establishes quite a distinction. But putting that aside, when the Spanish conquistadors first arrived in Mexico, the non-Aztec population looked to them hopefully to free them from Aztec oppression. In the early stages of American colonization, various tribes allied themselves with the conquering nations, France, Britain, Spain, Portugal. The Native American tribes went to war against other tribes. In the northern boreal forest, the warfare between Inuit and Indians was brutal and one-sided. The fur traders armed the Indians, but not the Inuit. Today, in what used to be called Great Whale River on Hudson's Bay, the Inuit and Cree lived together, worked together, prayed together. It was never a simple us versus them paradigm, nor was it static. Native Americans fight amongst themselves as much as Jews. The author Margaret Atwood states that Canadian culture has locked Native Americans into the role of victims. Woke culture has labeled these victims as helpless, in need of rescue by beneficent progressives. This is discussed at length by Jay Corwin in our book. To my mind, it's a tragedy when Native Americans see themselves as helpless victims. It makes them more vulnerable to exploitation.
Which brings me into my next question, Nathan. Professor Joy Corwin takes an academic approach to the issue of identity. He points out how so-called academic experts easily dismiss the real life experiences of Native Americans and insist on defining the realities for them. More than that, this demeaning attitude towards Aboriginals is integrated into Western literature, mythologies, and culture. What does he mean by this?
First, let me say that we hope to have Professor Corwin take part in the future webinar so that he can address this question more directly. He looks at our mythology, at Western mythology. The natives are the perpetual victim in need of rescue. It's the self-serving fantasy of the good white man saving the helpless native, whether in the story of the Puritans, the movie Dances with Wolves, the classic novel Lord Jim, or the movie Avatar. He describes it as a reminder to Aboriginals that they are only to be pitied. Victims are not allowed to play any other role because it spoils the fantasy. Professor Corwin likens this to the Jesus story of sacrifice. He compares this paradigm assigned to Native Americans to a passion play in which the Jews are the incarnation of evil. In the contemporary progressive mind, Jews mean Israel, and Israel is that incarnation of evil.
Well, let's get on to another little topic right over here. I know this is probably on the minds of quite a number of people. One misconception or myth that's bandied about is that Native Americans stem from the 10 lost tribes. Howard Schwartz and Kakam Flower refer to this myth in their articles. Where did this misconception originate, and when was it dispelled?
Okay. Perhaps the most clear-cut evidence of the connection between Jews and Indians comes from Mel Brooks in the film Blazing Saddles. Check out the YouTube link that we're going to provide you. But on a more serious note, an important part of Christian theology holds that their Messiah will reappear when the Jews accept him en masse. Unfortunately for them, we aren't doing it. So right off the bat, there was an ideological motive for identifying Native Americans as Jews. Bring them closer to Jesus, and you're bringing the second coming closer. There were many practices that could be pointed to in support of Native Americans being the 10 lost tribes. I've mentioned before the Eskimo practice of kashrut, that is the separation of land and sea animals, with serious consequences for violation. Inuit have vidui, confession of one's sins. This existed in a form that was separate from any Christian association. The Inca of Peru practiced circumcision. The Inca and some Mexican tribes had temples where they kept eternal fires going. Many tribes sequestered their women during their period, and some required a purification ritual similar to mikvah. There were tribes in which widows were required to marry their nearest male in-law, similar to Yibum. Jews and Indians wash frequently, anoint their heads, compute their times by nights, their calendar by the moon, and are very hospitable. An interesting 17th century commentator noted that the Indian women are easily delivered of their children without midwives, as in Exodus chapter 1, verse 19, reading that's coming up soon. You can see some of these connections required a lot of imagination. It's nice to know we're hospitable and clean. I want to note that besides these Christian observers, there were rabbis who believed the Indians were the 10 lost tribes and who didn't believe so in order to hasten the Christian end of days. But the religious ardor that the ideas of the Jews as 10 lost tribes had stirred up had a downside. Christianity always acknowledged that it descended from, or rather, replaced Judaism. If the savages were the 10 lost tribes, then Christianity would have to acknowledge that it was rooted in the savagery. That wasn't so popular, so the idea gradually faded from popular acceptance.
Still, quite a number that those myths still seem to be swirling around, but it's certainly understandable. You can, when you see the connections in these customs, you can see where it could possibly be coming from, this idea.
Well, I think that the biggest connection that we have with them, besides Mel Brooks, is that we're Aboriginal peoples who have been displaced from our lands and are working hard to reclaim them. That's the closest tie we have now.
Yeah, especially the love for the land, right? Which is what seems to be connecting us as peoples and as indigenous peoples. Our contributors are fascinating people in their own rights. This was a real experience for you and a real journey for you, Nathan, to connect with these people. Can you tell us a little bit about some of them?
Okay. Dr. David Yeagley, who died in 2014, was a 21st century Renaissance man. He attacked issues head on, paying little heed to those offended by his onslaughts. A controversial author, political commentator, classical composer, and biblical scholar, he was a strong conservative voice among American Indian intellectuals. To say the name David Yeagley was to some people the equivalent of saying Donald Trump. He stirred up so much controversy. He was intolerant of race baiting, people who claimed special privilege based on past or contemporary injustices. This earned him the enmity of liberal Indians and their supporters, who denied Yeagley's authenticity as well as his facts. He ridiculed those who claimed the words redskin or Indian are demeaning and carried both labels proudly. He denounced other ethnic groups who tried to latch on to past exploitation of Indians in order to advance the cause of their own victimization. This was aimed primarily at the Palestinians. Chacham, or rather Rabbi Yosef Fauer, Zecher Tzadik Levracha, was a fiercely independent thinker who wrote passionately about Sephardic Judaism, rabbinic semiotics, and Jewish law. Like Dr. Yeagley, he was controversial to the point that his rabbinic authority was on occasion challenged. We've reproduced his article, Jews, Conversos, and Native Americans, the Iberian Experience. This stunning essay traces the role of Visigothic military ideology in creating the conquistador, a superior being encrusted in iron, mercilessly destroying the other, first Jews, then Conversos, and later Native Americans. Fauer cites his masterpiece, The Horizontal Society, in which he explains that the principle of Ve'ahavta l'reyecha kamocha, you should love your neighbor as yourself, precludes the Jew from denying the humanity of others, from treating their lives as scrap. There are YouTube videos of him and about him. He was a prolific academic and rabbinic scholar, and I encourage you to look at his work. He died this past June. When I first arrived in an Inuit community, Uchituk Mark came to visit me to see who the new guy in town was. He brought his guitar along and proceeded to give me a 1960s folk music recital, singing Pete Seeger, Joan Baez, and other songs. I was stunned. He became my translator, and more so, he became my friend. We lost touch for quite some time, but reestablished it when I found him on Facebook. We got together in Montreal when he would come into town for cancer treatments. Unfortunately, the cancer got the best of him. Ryan Belrose and Mara Cohn are both alive, thank God, and we look forward to having them as panelists in the subsequent webinar. They're both among the most fascinating people that I know. Ryan is a hunter, a former oil patch worker, native rights activist, Israel activist, and friend. He's an effective public speaker who can hold an audience spellbound, not just with his smoothness, but with his intelligence. Mara is a retired military veteran who was called back to active service to help deal with the COVID crisis. She was a medevac flight nurse and chief of operational training for U.S. Air Force Tactical Operational Group. She served in places most of us would not want to visit, even in peacetime. Her character and her story, as recounted in our book, are truly inspirational.
Nathan, you lived among the Cree and the Inuit for extended periods. What did Native Americans teach you about your Jewish identity? And also, can you share with us your experiences? You write in the book a very, very interesting story about almost starving to death when you were with the Inuit. Can you elaborate on that?
When an Inuk told me that he's not a real Inuk, not a real Eskimo, because he doesn't live like his grandfather did, I said, that's ridiculous. I don't live like my grandfather did, but that doesn't make me any less Jewish than him. My grandfather, by the way, was an baked in the suburb of Warsaw and considered an Ilui as a rabbinic scholar. I thought about that discussion for a while and concluded that my Inuk friend was right. I was wrong. I started going to synagogue, keeping kosher, keeping Shabbat. You could say I learned how to be Jewish from my Inuk friend. The story about almost starving was among the Cree, not among the Inuit. We were inland from James Bay before the construction of the dams. A particular area was going to be flooded, and so the family that had the hunting rights, the trapping rights to that area, wanted to get all the animals, all the fur-bearing animals out, by out I mean dead, before the flooding killed them. So there were 17 of us living hundreds of miles from the nearest road, no telephone or anything like that. And we were living off the land. We had some supplies like shortening and tea and oatmeal, but pretty much everything else that we ate was food that we caught. One November morning, nobody was going hunting. Everybody was hanging around inside the teepee. I looked outside and saw that it was freezing rain. Okay. We had enough food stored up, enough fish, we had some meat. Second day, no one was going hunting again. It's still freezing rain. Third day, everybody was still sitting comfortably, not being nervous, not being at all concerned, and it was freezing rain and nobody was going hunting. So I turned to my friend, Bobby Visitor, and I said, no, we're not going hunting because of the freezing rain. He said, that's right. I said to him, what if the freezing rain keeps up? He shrugged his shoulders. We'd starve. I couldn't take that quite as calmly as he did. But as you can see, the freezing rain did let up. We did go out hunting, and we didn't starve. And Bobby's attitude, his concern about worrying about the future, connected with me in terms of Pirkei Avot, ethics of the fathers, that there's a teaching that says everything is in God's hands. When you're dependent for eating on the weather, it puts a very different gives you a very different orientation than whether your well-being depends on the economy, on interest rates, on whether a factory is moving here or there. It's a direct connection to God. It's a direct relation with God, and really gives you a sense of what his role is.
what you said, what you just said now, it reminded me of, how different we are from one another as peoples. What misconceptions do we have about Aboriginals in general?
Say the first is that we lump them all together, we conflate them all together. Whether we're talking on a tribal level, on a political level, on a cultural level. There are Aboriginal Americans who are farmers, there are Aboriginal Americans who are hunters. There are people, Aboriginal Americans, who are extremely left-wing, and there are those who are extremely right-wing. The Americas, the peoples of the Americas, were as different from one another as, let's say, the Han Chinese are from the British or the Spanish. It's a contiguous landmass from Ellesmere Island in northern Canada down to Tierra del Fuego at the tip of South America. And in that huge expanse of land, there are hundreds, thousands of cultures, thousands of languages, thousands of ways of life that someone from, let's say, a Plains Indian might find themselves with having much more in common with European resident of the prairies than with a native Indian American of the Amazon forest. They're just so different from one another. And I won't use the loaded term racist, but it's foolish to lump them all together.
That's one of the things that I learned in getting this book together is just my own I had to confront my own misconceptions about Aboriginal. And, I ended up at the end of this experience for me, having a great, great deal of respect for many of them because it is not an easy life. And for their ancestors and them to have survived these very harsh conditions, you have to be very smart to do that. You have to be very capable. So I have one final question. How can Israel and Native Americans benefit from their relations? Both of us being Aboriginal peoples.
The one specific that I would mention now is the Navajo cooperation with Israel in terms of agriculture in arid lands. But I'd rather put off your question for our next webinar. It's something that I'd like to get into in depth in a future webinar related to the book.
So I think this part of the webinar is at a conclusion. So I believe the next part is the Q&A, and let's take a look at what some of the questions that have come in. We have quite a number of questions that come in. Are Palestinians successful in making contact with North American Aboriginals in support of their cause?
Yes, not just the Palestinians, but their supporters from other Muslim societies. It's actually gotten to the point in places like Minnesota and Wisconsin where recent refugees are marrying into Native American communities, and according to some of the Ojibwa Indians, are exercising undue influence on community affairs. As was mentioned earlier, many of the Native Americans buy into the paradigm that they're victims. And it's easy to be a victim, although it's not very productive. And so when they have someone that can support them in their self-conception of being victims, oh yes, we're all victims together, people go for it.
When you're talking about the interconnection between other peoples and Native Americans, this person who I actually was the doctor who I had interviewed for an article that I was writing about his experience in Nunavut. And he gave me some inside information about what is happening in Nunavut. One of the things that he told me was that, there's a lot of activity going on there in terms of building, and there's a lot of opportunities for people to make quite a bit of money. So as a result of that, people are coming in from all over the world to work over there, to build and to do other things. When he arrived in Nunavut for the first time, this is an Orthodox Jewish doctor, and he gets off the plane, and there is a taxi driver, taxi's there, and he gets onto the taxi, and the taxi driver notices his kippah on his head, and he starts talking to him in Hebrew. Now, that was the last thing he expected to do, getting into Nunavut, is having a taxi driver who spoke to him in Hebrew. But this was a Muslim. He was from Lebanon. And apparently, a huge amount of Muslims have moved into Nunavut. They built a mosque. In fact, there was a mosque across the street from them. As far as Jews are concerned, it was very... they do have a Jewish community over there, but it's pretty small. But they all keep very close to one another. In fact, he was telling me further with this story that as he was getting into the taxi, a Jewish woman drove by as well. So within a few minutes, he almost felt at home over there. It was also interesting because he says there was kosher food available. They were bringing in kosher cheese from Winnipeg. So it was a very interesting experience. He had been there for many years, and he saw the difference. He really saw the difference of the development that was going on over there. So I just found that very interesting. Here's another question. What initiatives are taking place today between the Jewish community in Israel and Aboriginal peoples to increase the ties between them?
It's something that I'm really not that well informed about. There are some initiatives going on, many by private or nonprofit organizations. There's some business cooperation, some business connections, as I mentioned earlier. We hope to have a panel in the future connected to our book that will deal more in depth with that issue.
In an article that I recently read, I mentioned this organization, Building Bridges, that Ryan Belrose has co-founded. And I don't know how long they've been in existence, but some of the initiatives that they want to institute are relations between Israel, direct relations between Israel and Indigenous people, which means having Indigenous people come to Israel and to experience Israel, and having Israelis come to their countries or their land and experience living in a reserve. Because there's a lot that they share. They share a love for the land, and Israel, of course, is doing phenomenal work with its technology in terms of the land and how to work the land. And Native Americans have been doing that for generations as well. Their ability to preserve the land in their own unique way is something that the two countries can benefit from each other in that regard. They also want to go into Jewish schools, teach Jewish children about Native Americans and their customs. So all seem like very interesting endeavors and initiatives. Here's another question. What are the historical and legal connections, precedents between the Canadian government's Indian Act, residential schools, and other oppressive policies and anti-Jewish laws in Europe? Was the ghetto system the model for the Indian Act and the reservation system?
That's really a great question. And I never thought about that issue until I saw your question. The Canadian Government Indian Act made it that Indians, or Native Americans if you prefer, are lacking the ability to take liens on their property. Everything is held sort of in trust for them. They are a protected group who can't act independently. The implication of this is that Native Americans can't go to a bank and get financing for a project they have in mind, using something they own as collateral. By contrast, the ghettos and oppressive, oppressive policies that were enacted against the Jews ended up encouraging them to get into loans and financing. So although they were both acts against groups of people, they had the opposite effect and the opposite direction. Now, the residential schools, interesting issue. There are people who will argue that they were set up with good motives to educate the Native Americans, to make them able to function in society. But whether that's true or not doesn't affect the fact that the larger effect was to deculture Native Americans. My friend Bobby Visitor, who I mentioned before, was hit on the back with a baseball bat by one of his teachers for speaking Cree in school. They were really trying to take the kids away from their culture, away from their native way of life. What about the schools in Europe? There's a famous story about how the Volozhin Yeshiva was forced to adopt a secular curriculum, and the head of the yeshiva preferred to simply shut the yeshiva down rather than teach any secular studies. That's a very controversial, or rather story, because another version of the story has it that the yeshiva already was teaching secular studies, and it was only at the behest of the enlightened Jews, the Maskilim, that the Russian government was pushed to insist that the whole curriculum be secular studies, with no time whatsoever for Jewish studies, and then it was shut down by its director. So in this case, it wasn't the government trying to deculture the people, take away their culture and their way of life. It was the enlightened Jews who were trying to take away the culture and the beliefs of their less enlightened brethren.
You use words Indian and Eskimo. Aren't these words, aren't they discouraged from being used today?
My experience is that the more traditional Native Americans don't have a problem with being called Indians or Eskimo. The ones who are more into the political correctness, into the cancel culture, they're the ones who get concerned about it. I found when I was in the Inuit community, I had a discussion with a very traditional man who said he's proud of being an Eskimo. He explained to me that the word Eskimo means eater of raw meat. And he said, we are eaters of raw meat. That's how we like our food traditionally. So being called an Eskimo to him was a compliment.
When did it not become a compliment? When did it become a derogatory name? Do you have an idea?
I can't really pin it down. I haven't done any detailed investigation to it. The traditional story is that the explorers came to North America and thought they were in India, and so they started calling them Indians because they thought they were in India. The irony in that story is that India is not the name of the people of India, that the people of India use for their country, but rather an adaptation from a reference to the Indus River. And so calling Native Americans Indians is calling them after a river in Southern Asia.
Here's another question. Islam is a proselytizing faith, and I understand there are fundamentalists claiming it's the natural religion of the Native people. Are you aware of a movement to convert our Canadian Indigenous people?
As I mentioned before, in In Minnesota and Wisconsin, there are serious concerns. There's also issues, I'm told, in the U.S. Southwest on these matters. I can't really answer from any expertise to what extent that is going on, but proselytizing religions do tend to proselytize as much as they can get away with it.
The news always shows how difficult and poor are the lives of the Inuit. Why is this so? And is it really as widespread as shown in the news? As part of that question, you had given us in the book, you write a very interesting story about your friends. I don't know if it was just, unique to your particular friends, about their attitude towards money. It's very different than our attitude is towards money, for instance. Obviously we don't want people to go without and to be poor if we can help it. But can you address this question as it was posed and perhaps speak a little bit more about their general attitude towards life and money?
The poverty level of the Inuit is not something that I can really address in terms of the contemporary situation. When they were living mostly off the land and were dependent on catching animals and fish in order to survive, they were living on very much a knife's edge in many situations. There was widespread starvation among Inuit in certain eras. I think it was the 1930s. There was just a lot of people perished because they weren't successful in catching food. I know that with resource development, a lot of lives have been enriched with government transfer payments or government jobs. There are a lot of people who are doing fairly well. With regards to Native American attitudes towards money, I would say again, we can't lump them together. As there are so many differences, and it really depends on the tribe and the culture and the individual. My friend Bobby was told that he could make a claim for $10,000 for the suffering he endured at a residential school, and his response was, "What would I do with $10,000?" To him, it was a puzzle. He didn't have a telephone, he didn't have a penny to his name, but he was just $10,000 a foreign concept to him, and he wasn't looking for it. On the other hand, there are many Native American entrepreneurs who are doing fairly well. We can tie this back to what I mentioned before about the Indian Act preventing many Native Americans from going into business, but they have found ways through corporations, through various setups, that there are many Native American entrepreneurs. A lot of the oil patch suffering, a lot of companies losing business in the oil patch in Alberta are controlled or have heavy investments from Native American people, or have huge Native American employee bases. And those are all being made to suffer.
Somewhat along those lines, what I can perhaps add to this is what this individual, this doctor who worked among the Inuit for many years. And what he told me is that unfortunately, their lifespan is 10 years younger than in the rest of Canada. And there are many reasons for this. Is it not true that Native Americans or Aboriginals believe the land cannot be owned as individual?
The idea is that all the Native groups differ from one another. They have different kinds of beliefs. The land cannot be owned by an individual. That is a fact in Canada. That's more a function of the Indian Act, forcing the communal ownership or the band being the trustee or the government being the trustee. Ownership, possession of the land is something that's been examined by many anthropologists who will give you a million different opinions about it. And generally those opinions, those evaluations will reflect the anthropologists' interest in setting up an exotic people with exotic beliefs that they can say they're studying and explaining.
We have one final question. How do you respond? What do you say to all those people who acknowledge the ties between the land of Israel and Jews, but who still argued that Jews had no moral right to recover a land that they lost centuries ago? They usually add that if all peoples were to recover lands that they lost hundreds of years ago, the whole world map would have to be reshuffled and chaos would ensue.
Well, I think read the rest of the question, because I think that really gives a good answer to it.
Okay, Jabotinsky responded to this critique by stressing that there was a difference between a homeless people wanting to return to its ancient homeland and a people that already has its own land and that wants to expand its borders for irredentist reasons. Is there another homeless indigenous nation that tries to acquire its own patch of land? In other words, a Native American version of Zionism?
I think that many of the Native American peoples are doing just that. They may be living on the land, but what they want is more direct control, where they're making the rules. They're deciding what goes on there rather than outsiders controlling it. It would be almost like people living in their land wanting to overthrow or get rid of a colonial power. In terms of the first part of Mr. Bokbot's question, he talks about the Jews possibly not having the right to recover land they lost centuries ago. But the Jews were always there. There were rarely any periods when there were no Jews in the land of Israel. If they weren't there, or if they were in severely reduced numbers, it was because of the rules and the policies of the colonial administrators, whether they were the Ottoman Turks or the British colonialists, who totally ignored the rules of the British mandate given to them by the League of Nations and let in thousands upon thousands of Muslims from many, many regions and kept the Jews out. So it's not like we were not there and sort of lost interest in it. We were always there, and we always wanted to go back there, and we always wanted to control it. In terms of land that was lost centuries ago, if we look at North America, we look at the Cherokee, let's say, relocated from their ancestral homes and in another part of the United States. There were many shifts in geography and geographical location between Native American tribes in the immediate pre-contact period. The Inuit of the Eastern Arctic have stories about exterminating or chasing out another people, the Dorset people, and this supposedly happened in the late pre-contact era. What I heard afterwards, and I don't remember the source, is that these people, the Dorset people, supposedly moved to the Western Arctic and were relocated there. So people do move around. People do shift around. It's true. But so many people are still in the same lands, are still in their ancestral lands, and want to remain there. And so many people were scattered. But being scattered and being kicked out doesn't take away your right to go back and to take it back.
I want us to take this opportunity to thank Alan and Doris, our chair people of the Toronto chapter, and thank you from all of us here in Montreal for being with us. Also, I want to thank Professor Krantz, our director and founder, and thank you, the audience, for coming and joining us, and all our supporters. And